This is House Planning Help episode 251. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. And coming up in this session, my guest is TV presenter Charlie Luxton. Looking forward to this one. We're going to find out what he's learned through just being part of lots of projects through his architectural practice, his TV work, building the dream, and also doing it himself. Yes, his own self-build project. And I think trying to do this all together has been a challenge, to say the least. I'm going to start with an observation because I've been lucky enough to work with Charlie. That's how I met him. It was the Cozy Homes Oxfordshire project, which I look forward to telling you more about, but still under wraps. When it's got its official launch, I'll tell you all about it. I think there's some videos that you'll enjoy. It's particularly based around retrofit, which we all know is more tricky, isn't it? And what I really enjoyed about working with Charlie is that he manages to use good analogies and ways of explaining things to get the message across. That's what a good communicator is all about, isn't it? And I really enjoy that, and particularly looking back at it afterwards when you're filming it and you're all in the middle of it, you don't notice it so much, and then you step back and think, wow, that's a really good way of explaining it. And of course he understands it all because of his practice and his background, so those two things combined. And the other thing, you can't teach this, is just the passion as well. Before I started recording, we were having a chat about the trees that they're going to plant to try and offset. They use some high embodied energy materials in some of the construction, as you're about to hear about in a few moments. So they've got the plans to plant all of these trees to offset what they have done, and they're concerned about the amount that they're flying, trying to cut that right back, eating lots of vegetarian food, lots of the right things. Oh, and Charlie's going to be at the AECB conference that we talked about a couple of times recently, so that's going to be interesting, seeing what presentation he puts together for that. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? And I started by asking him how he became involved in architecture and sustainable design.
How I ended up doing architecture is I've often thought back about this. I mean, I kind of wanted to be an architect or work in architecture from about the age of 12, 13. And I think one of my earliest memories is with my brother building a treehouse when I lived in Australia, in Sydney. And I remember doing that, and I remember it being very satisfying, enormously satisfying. Then I moved to England when I was about 10, and we moved to a farm. And on that farm, we had hay bales, and hay bales are the most wonderful sort of tectonic building material that you can have as a kid, because they're big, you can move them around if they're straw bales, and you can make forms and rooms and tunnels and dens. And so we did that endlessly all the time, and then moved to making dens out of pallets, more tree houses. Even with some friends, we dug a den underneath the floor slab of a derelict industrial building on near where his housing estate in the next door village. So I it sort of struck me recently that I've always been interested in making things on that sort of scale. I also did a lot of sculpture at university, at school and university. And then so making was always a part of it. I think when I got to university and started my architecture training, I'd been traveling around the world to India and seeing how other people lived. And I think sort of getting a wider understanding, although I'm not sure I really got it at the time, of how the world was rapidly changing. And that you think that there are these wild places and there aren't as many as you might imagine. And I think that was a bit of a shock. I was opened up to a lot of different people on those journeys, and I think I sort of questioned the way that we started doing things. And as soon as I got to university, I latched pretty much in my second year right into sustainability. So this is 1994, 95 that I was really sort of got interested in it. And I remember it being a very fringe. There was no one taught it at school at all, but it was quite a fringe activity. But I was really focused on it right from the very beginning of my architectural training.
Well, there are quite a few things we could talk about because you have built your own home, a self-build, so we're definitely interested in that. There's the ecological side that I think you're someone who, you really try and make a difference. So I'm hoping to bring that out in this interview as well. But then there's the TV stuff too. So maybe we could start with that, because you must have seen loads and loads of projects, and we're always looking for useful information for self-builders. So do you see any themes emerging from that, from your visits, from your encounters?
The biggest sort of lesson that I really try and instill in my practice, with the guys that work with me, is do less better. And I try, and whenever I go and meet someone and I'm looking at their project with them while they're building, is to try and rein people the scale of what people are trying to do in, but just do it better. Because if you build well and you build sustainably, you will enjoy the space so much more. It will last better. It won't be a kind of an albatross around your neck. I mean, you see so many builds that when they get to the final finishing stage, they're just sort of thrown together, and you just know it's going to be a maintenance nightmare. And actually, building a house takes an enormous amount of energy. The embodied energy is vast, right? I think we're only just starting to understand that. So if you're going to do it, it's a real responsibility to do it well, so it's going to last for a long time. So sometimes in order to do that, it can't be as big as you might be able to build. You have to make it a bit smaller and just make it better, because well designed and well built, a small house can be just as successful and provide as much usable space as a badly designed large house. So I think the main thing, do less better.
Some people might say that you're almost driven by the plot because of economics. Do you think that's true, or can you always have the size house that you want to?
Well, clearly economics play a role in it, but I think this idea of the market is a misnomer in many cases. This idea, I've sat with, I've done 95 Building the Dreams, right? And plus many other shows of self-build programs. So that's just that one show, 95 people. And so many of the times you sit there before they start building with their plans, and they're like, well, we've got to have 4 bedrooms because, the market, it needs 4 bedrooms. The market's, it's got to resale value. It's got to have 4 bedrooms. So, and I'm looking at these plans, and there's 2 all right bedrooms, maybe an all right master bedroom. And then there's a couple that are just downright useless. And you're like, right, you've totally compromised this house. And there's only 2 people that are going to live in it, for example. And this is often the way I've seen it. There's literally 2 people going to rattle around in this 4-bedroom house. And the thing is, when you're building your own house, you're going to have it for 20 years statistically. If you're just moving, it's every 7. But if you self-build, that's about 20 years. You're building in what somebody else wants for the next 20 years. It's insanity. Actually, less bedrooms, better space. Do less bedrooms, do better. Do the circulation space right. And I believe firmly that if the architecture is right and the build quality is right, the sale price will reflect that. Because actually, if you're selling a house, somebody else will want a similar thing to what you've wanted. You're not so unique that it's going to be, in most cases, that somebody else will want it.
How do they start down that track, just so I can see if I can understand it? Because you draw up your brief of the things that you need, you would like. So 4 bedrooms, is it just Fred down the road's got 4 bedrooms and that's how we sell houses, 4-bedroom?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's the market. It's this thing, the market says, well, 4 bedrooms is worth more than 3 bedrooms. So therefore, the plot can take 4 bedrooms. Therefore, we have to get 4 bedrooms. And I think people always push themselves. They always go, well, we can afford to build a 160 square metre house, but we're going to try and build 180 because it will be cheaper. And guess what? It isn't. And guess what? The prices that you see in the magazines aren't accurate, and they don't reflect the reality for most people building. So often they end up biting off more than they chew, and they end up compromising what they deliver. So again, it comes back, actually, if you can afford to build 180 square metres at, £2,000 a square metre, I would say build 160 square metres at 2,150 or whatever the maths is, but just do less and do it better. And if it's delivered right, I am convinced it will have the same value as a 4-bed house if it's really well designed.
When you meet people, do you feel they've done enough research?
I think people do a lot of research. I nearly always meet people who haven't been prepared to spend enough money on good design. And I think that is at the heart of where a lot of people make a mistake. Now, that's rich coming from me, isn't it? You know what I mean?
But I sort of know what you mean, having been through the process, that we feel that we invested in a good design. But what's that? For a lot of people, it's just a number on their spreadsheet. How do you justify your architect, your designer, and how much you allot to them?
Well, okay, so going back to your first question about research, I think a lot of people have done a lot of abstract research around buying things because we are enormously good consumers, right? We are A-grade consumers, trained from the very first moments of consciousness. We're looking at adverts, looking in magazines. I want that game. I want that Lego thing. I want whatever. So we're brilliant at buying stuff. So normally the research that people do when they're trying to build a house is, what stuff am I going to get? What stuff am I going to buy? Rather than, what kind of house do I really want to live in? How do I want it to feel? How many modern houses have I been to see? And most of them have been to almost none. Actually been and visited a new house built by somebody else that might be a very sustainable house or a new, take on a traditional house or whatever it might be.
This is so valuable, isn't it? And I'm always bashing on about this, that you can go to houses you don't like. Sometimes I think, because you can get stuck. I think many people's first self-build can actually be with all the baggage that they've got from the past. And then the second time round, you think, whoa. When you do see them do it a second time, it's often very, very different.
I think one of the things that I've learned about self-build over the years is you're only ever really ready to do your first self-build after you've finished your first self-build. So,
it's crazy, isn't it, that you go into this? I mean, it's a lot of fun, but building a house when you're starting from zero. Yeah. And that's why I personally feel you should invest in a design professional because of that.
Yeah, and I think if people did more research about the varied outcomes of people working with really good design specialists or without them, they would find it much easier to justify the expenditure of a design professional. And I think they would see that the outcomes are noticeably better, in my experience.
Do people take advice well when you've offered it?
Mainly, I mean, we've got hundreds of different clients, and some of them I have sat down and said to them, I really don't know why you're paying me if you're not going to listen to what I've got to say. And sometimes you get to that point. Nearly always, people do listen. And as somebody said to me the other day, you guys don't have a monopoly on good ideas. And they're absolutely right. Designers, architects don't have a monopoly on good ideas. What they do almost invariably have a monopoly on is design process. How you take an idea, how you draw it, how you test it, and crucially, how you tear it up, learn from it, and start again. Because most people who are not trained as designers or in these areas or in any kind of design will get an idea and they'll just keep evolving it. They'll never sort of tear it up and go, actually, that didn't work, I've got to start again. So most people, I think, once they get involved with us or with a good architect, good designer, realizes there's a strong process there if they're good. And then they kind of value what's being told to them. The issue, and I'm totally aware of this, there's a lot of bad designers out there. There's a lot of bad architects out there. There's a lot of people that are just going through the motions and wheeling out the same old stuff without looking at context, without looking at the specifics of brief, about the specifics of even site. Where are the views? Where's the sun? And there's a lot of designers and architects that frankly are bad. So again, it comes back to your point of research. You need to choose a professional. You need to find out what the varying options cost. You need to go and see their buildings that they've built. You need to kick the tires. What do they feel like? Because you can walk into a house and get a sense of what your home is going to feel like at the end of the process if you've been to two of their other houses and they have a certain feel, because they tend to be similar. And if they're a bit crappy, the chances are yours is going to be a bit crappy. If they're good, the chances are it's going to be good. So I think the research you've got to do is find a really good partner to work with to deliver this. And it might not just be the guy in the yellow pages down the road or the woman in the yellow pages down the road. It's about finding people that are good. Unfortunately, it costs. And I know that, for example, in our practice, our hourly charge rates are very similar to other practices, from small practices to big practices, lower than bigger practices, but quite, relative to a one-man band, let's say. But we'll just do more hours. And that's how we get quality. It's just about time, and that costs. But it's, if the person you're paying is designing your building and dictating every single element that goes into that building and how they come together, surely it's some of the most important money you're going to spend.
What about the actual...
therein endeth the adverts for architectural design.
Don't worry about that.
No, I mean, it always sounds hard coming from somebody who makes their living out of designing for people, but... whoever you go to, I think it really is the one of the most important moves.
Anything else from the TV shows when you go back at the end? Do people always enjoy the process?
No, I think invariably most people don't. I think they do, in hindsight, once, I think there's this thing that when you finish a self-build, it normally takes about 6 months to fall back in love with it. I mean, I was scarred by building my own house. I mean, I'm not going to lie, because I was doing TV, running a business, building this house as the principal contractor and finishing it. And it was a technically quite challenging house, and it drove me close to the edge.
Come on, Charlie, you've done a nice link across there. So let's talk about this then. When did you start thinking about this build? Because you were in a lovely thatched cottage, weren't you?
Yeah, no, and we still have that thatched cottage. We moved here 12 years ago. I have to say, I didn't really have an idea then that we'd build a new house here, but I knew that there was an outbuilding that we could convert. And so we bought a thatched cottage and a little outbuilding and just under an acre of ground, and very nice. But the cottage sits on a common, so you can't extend it. So we convert.
So what does that mean, a common?
Well, it means that the land is owned by the people, and it's controlled nominally by the parish council, although the Commons Commission and various other people have oversight over all of that. So it is common land. So
do you have a garden?
I have a tiny bit of land that is around the cottage that is walled in, but other than that, I can walk on it, I can sit on it, and we've always eaten out. My kids have spent their childhood on the common, but anyone else can come and spend their, but I can't build on it. And making any changes to that land holding is incredibly archaic, expensive, and time-consuming. So almost a no-go. So I knew that the cottage couldn't get extended. I converted this small barn. We lived in the cottage and had the office in the barn, and realised that we needed a bigger house, and I didn't want to move. I loved where we live. I love where we live. I love this part of the world. It's been a joy to be here. So I put my thinking cap on and went to planning to knock down the outbuilding, dig down a bit and build a new house. And then we would always keep the cottage, really was the idea for the office. And I just love it. I don't want to get rid of it. And that was my, one of my very early, really sustainable refurbishments. And so it's very precious to us. So went to planning and they said, 4 pages of no, you can't build this. So I just took that apart with my planning consultant and we ticked them off one by one. And eventually it was supported by the planning officer and we got it straight through. And we did that by sort of losing the building. We had to disappear the barn, had to lose a building to get a building. So when you look out now, it's almost impossible to see the house. It sort of disappears into the landscape very much.
What did the dialogue look like? Were you finding out what they would say yes to?
Well, I'd love to say it was that sort of consensual, but no. It's unfortunately planning often. Yeah, often planning is a bit more dysfunctional than that now. No, the dialogue was, okay, these are your problems. So then we just tick them off.
What? Give us a few examples.
Okay, so contaminated land. They were worried about contamination. They were worried about spread. They were worried about separation of the building from the other building over time. They were worried about the visual appearance of it, because it was a very simple design I put in. I basically put in something really simple so that they would shoot it to pieces and I knew where they were, what their issues were, and then I could design accordingly. And it took 3 iterations to get to planning. I then redesigned it twice after that because I'm a terrible client. Anyway, that's another story.
But how has it been being the client? Well, I'm actually playing a few roles in this.
I think loaded would be the answer, because it's sort of like, it's even more loaded because of what I do. I mean, and that's an internal pressure I put on myself. I wanted to do something good, better than good. And so it became quite loaded. But yeah, so I think hard is the answer. And it took ages to get to this. Originally it was 2 stories and then I got 2 planning permissions like that. And then eventually I was washing the car up by the road. And I had like 6 conversations with neighbours, which I've always loved about this area. And I suddenly thought, wait a second, if I have my veg garden and I live down by the stream away from the road, I won't have the conversation. So suddenly I thought, well, if I put my veg garden on the roof, I can have a conversation with people as they walk past seeing me doing my veg garden badly. And that would be nice. Otherwise, this part of the, a little bit of community in the village sort of is lessened. I didn't want that. So then I changed it to a bungalow, effectively, a single-storey dwelling at that point.
What did you want from it as a family?
A very sustainable home. I wanted it to be very low energy. I mean, we're not passive certified, but all the elements are passive.
Did you model it in PHPP?
No, I didn't actually, I'll be honest with you. The only thing that would let it down are the roof lights. Didn't model it in PHPP. I got to the point of being about to model it in PHPP and I spoke to my PHPP. I was actually more interested in overheating because you can always put on a heater. It's very hard to stop something getting too hot. So we got to the point of wanting to know if I should put external louvering, active louvering over the windows. And I was about to get PHPP at that point. And my PHP guy said, he looked at it and said, you're going to be very close to passive house. And to be honest with you, overheating is going to be a problem. So just put on the louvers and save the money for the passive house. Because I wasn't going to get certified. In hindsight, we should have PHPP. You know, we used to use a couple of energy modeling software in the practice, and they were just not good enough at overheating. And so we're trying to refocus back onto PHPP, but this one, because I was doing this after
fascinating.
work.
I saw the video. Well, I'll link this into the show notes with the overheating, you explaining the shuttering that you've got. But when I saw that video, I suddenly said to myself, why did we not put in any external shuttering, particularly from that point of view of the climate changing? We don't know what the future might have, because our house is modelled never to go over 25 degrees, which we're very pleased with. I mean, that's the best you can get, 0% risk of that. And so far, one thing that I've noticed that's quite fun is that you may have had a dig at me. I'm in my shorts at the moment, but when you get warmer temperatures in the summer, it feels all right in the house. Whereas if you got a 22 or something like that in the winter, that would be really hot. So just the difference of living like that. But yeah, tell me how you're using your shutters then.
Well, I think a big problem with a lot of modern architecture is that it's just very hot. It's overheating. And I didn't want that. So we wanted a lot of glazing for connection to the landscape. It's a one-sided building because it's dug into the hillside, so we could have no windows on one side. So
hence the roof lights as well.
Hence roof lights. Hence sort of overcompensating, if you like, on the non-earth sheltered side. When you do modelling of some path, you realise that this is actually a very difficult country to do low energy architecture in, because the sun has such a massive range from the middle of winter being very low to being very high in summer. And to actually shade that passively with overhangs is quite hard. They get very, very large. And if you have a lot of glass, it only has to be, you can, in September, late September.
There's your answer. The purists would say, cut down the amount of glass.
Yeah, of course they would. Absolutely. And you make choices, don't you?
But it's architecture too, isn't it?
And I think actually for us, architecture comes not before environment, but I don't think you can ignore architecture and just focus solely on the environment, because if a building is really good architecturally and 95% as good as 100, as a full passive building, to me that's got real validity. And I think there's always choices to be made about why you put in a window for a view or for overheating or for heat loss. So it's a hugely complicated thing, and I'm not saying we've got it right, and we always have to be refocusing our efforts. And that's what's brilliant about passive house, is that it gives you that standard, that gate, yes or no, are you in or out? As soon as you're not doing it, it's a bit more vague, and you can start to abuse that or drift away from the purity. But getting back to overheating, was in order to passively stop overheating with louvers or with brise-soleil, or they get massive, right? So in this climate, it seems to me a very good option is to actively do it. So to have a movable louver system, so that all winter the louvers are completely open. We've got lovely views of whatever, and any sun that's coming out, we get loads of it. When you really need the heat in winter, you can get quite a chunk of it actually from that. Our heating season is probably late November through to late February. Other than that, we don't need any, and that's them done by wood pellet. But we don't need any other.
Why did you choose that?
Because I already had it.
Right.
I had it, put it in 10 years ago in the cottage because it was the only thing that I could put in really. So.
But that's not coming from the cottage.
Yes.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. So we've got a district heating main, highly insulated main that connects the two buildings. So the rainwater harvesting comes down and the wood pellet heating comes backwards and forwards, as well as having solar thermal. So with the solar gain issue, that actually to have an active control system with external louvering seemed to make a lot of sense. And so, that was a big kind of new thing for us to do. We've done it once on a building, with one louver because it was obviously going to overheat with easterly sun. And here we went for it. I mean, I always use these opportunities to build my own houses to test stuff on myself before I do it on clients, because the last thing I want is something not working for a client. I'd rather it didn't really work well for me, because I can put it in context and deal with it and make phone calls and get it fixed. And
that is a challenge though, isn't it, for people that work in construction just generally, isn't it? How do you make sure that you're constantly progressing? Because not every architect gets a chance to build their own house.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's why they have continued professional development kind of staff. But it's one thing to sit in a lecture and be told stuff. It's quite another to reach into your own pocket, pay for something and live with the consequences. And I think it's a really useful process if anyone could do it. And I would recommend anyone who is in architecture to try and build their own houses, to learn things, or if failing that, to do proper post-occupancy analysis, which is a massive failure in the whole of architecture. Going back to your buildings when they're finished and actually working out how well they worked compared to the way they should have done in a diagram. And, we try it. We're not perfect, far from it, but we try and learn as many lessons as we can. When I did the cottage, that was 10, 11 years ago when we started that. And I'd been designing sort of low-energy refurbishments for quite a while. And invariably, we design all this stuff, we get to budget, cost-cutting, value engineering, the sort of sanitized way of describing it. And a lot of this stuff would get cut out. And so when I did the cottage, it was like, no, I'm going to do this 100%. So we did wood fiber and lime internal insulation. We dug out the floors, put in 200 mil of insulation under the floor. We insulated under the thatch. We put in rainwater harvesting. We put in all no MDF, all sort of local European hardwoods, mainly Scottish elm, that would cut down from the great estates in Scotland from diseased and old trees, so it was not even clear felling. So we really put a lot of effort, and then wood pellet boiler, and then solar thermal on this building. So, super amount of learning.
But on this one, your hands have been tied a little bit with the build system, haven't they?
With this one, planning played into it because we needed to hide the building. It's effectively a shelter dug into a hillside. So immediately you're doing that, you're then using reinforced concrete, because that's how you hold soil up, basically. You like it one way or the other.
That's quite a lot of soil, isn't it?
It's quite a lot of soil. Well, yeah, apparently it's 3-ton horizontal push, or 3-ton per square metre onto the entire back of this wall, which was amazing to me when the structural engineer calculated it. So there's an enormous amount of push onto the back wall. That meant that we had to have a fairly chunky floor slab. And then because we've got a green roof, like a 200 mil intensive wildflower roof, we had to have a concrete roof. So we used this, it's all GGBS, so granulated ground blast furnace slag. So that reduces the amount of concrete that you need. So it's all 60%. So, we've made a big chunk there of reducing the CO2. So then the external walls are concrete block, 140 mil concrete block on the inside with a timber I-beam, and then fully blown, actually with a high-performance polystyrene bead, because we were a bit limited on depth. So I didn't use wood fibre in that situation, but normally I would. It was a slight get out of jail card at that point because of the louver heads as much as anything. And it complicated. I think I'm going into a bit detail.
Right. We do like detail. Externally then, how does the building look, or did you want it to look?
Well, just briefly, just to go back a second, the issue around all that concrete obviously is the embodied energy. So you end up with a very thermally massive building, and a building that uses a lot of CO2. I think there's no two ways about that. The way that you can try and offset that or kind of ameliorate that in some ways is we have a power floated concrete floor that's got the underfloor heating in it. That floor is the finish. So we didn't have to buy a wood floor or a porcelain floor, which is very energy intensive. Even a wooden floor, a lot of manufacturing, didn't have to do that, and sealants and glues, and didn't have to do any of that. That floor is the floor. It is structure, heating, and floor finish in one, done. So the concrete block is straight onto that with a lime plaster onto the concrete block. So we've tried, then we're using the concrete block, A, to give a sort of rigidity, a sturdiness to the walls, B, to give that thermal mass so we can sort of iron out any temperature fluctuations with a thermally massive building. So that's how you try and make what is on one level a problem, using so much concrete, into something of a strength. So it's a bit of judo. Externally, we used a lot of the local stone. So from my perspective, I like using local materials. Great architecture is about context in many ways, in many cases, I think. For me, obviously the international modernism slightly varies, but I really like a modernism that is about place and people and culture. We used stone from a quarry about 3.5 miles away that was then brought in blocks to the stone yard.
Does it become more attractive at that point when you think, 3 miles away, that's brilliant, proper sense of place?
Yeah, of course. And the inspiration for the building from day one has been the big old viaduct piers that are straight in front of us that were taken out in 62 under the beaching cuts. And there's just these wonderful kind of Victorian pillars that kind of heroic, almost like Roman ruins. And that's the inspiration for the architecture of the building. So using the local stone was really good because Hook Norton had a lot of stone quarrying, mainly for iron. Actually, they smelted it for iron. And so we used the stone, which is iron, called ironstone, and we used core 10 because of a reference to the local steel industry. And the outside of the building is also inspired by railway bridges and that you get around the M25, which seems like a slightly weird inspiration. But, there you go. That's where I got carried away.
What other challenges have you had then on this project?
Management.
Yeah, you said you were busy.
Management, I'm not a builder. I run an architecture practice. I do TV. I'm not a builder. And I think we did a pretty good job, but there were times when I found the management side of it really important. I mean, I did all the sourcing. I bought pretty much everything apart from a few bags of sand and a few bags of cement. I literally phoned up, ordered and bought everything. And that took an enormous amount of time. We had an unfortunate issue around plastering where we had a mistake on plastering, which was so painful. And actually, it was going fine until then. But just at that point when you're exhausted and running out of money, more importantly, running out of emotional strength, you hit problems and you have to sort of try and get through that. And I found that incredibly hard, actually, really hard. It was a very unfortunate situation that no one could have seen, but it was just very painful.
Again, we'll put that video into the show notes because you go into a lot more detail.
Oh yeah, don't go down that rabbit hole. It was very interesting. I learned a couple of things when doing this build. There's a few sayings that one is like today's overinvestment is tomorrow's bargain, and I think when you're building, if you just take a very short-termist view, or an accountant's, and I don't mean that to be too as much of a sort of pejorative statement, but an accountant's view of what you should invest, I think sometimes that's wrong. And mainly that's because at the moment, for the last 20 years, build costs have outstripped inflation quite significantly. So if you build it today and it costs more and you go further than you want to, it's going to be cheaper than building it in 10, 15 years' time. So, and actually if you do it right now, you won't go back and redo it. So you save sort of wasted materials of going back and redoing something, and B, you save the cost uplift that's likely to happen. The second thing I learned is in the search for perfection, the one thing you're bound to find is insanity. And I think trying to finish this house, you've got to let things go. You've got to be proportionate. And I think a lot of people really struggle with that. And I think if you accept that early on, that it's never going to be perfect, much as I'm not perfect, no one I know is perfect, then I think you find it a much easier ride.
And what advice do you give off the back of your project, speaking to a self-builder, trying to tell them what it's like? Planning, as in really working out your cost plan before you get going. How do you do that?
With a QS. I went to a QS, and I then managed to persuade the QS, and I went to QS very upfront. I mean, I worked with him a lot, so he was kind of open to it. I said, when you've done the QS, I want the spreadsheet, because I want to then populate that spreadsheet with my own figures. And I took his spreadsheet and added to it and changed it, and that was a really useful guide to understand where I was going. I so often see people who are kidding themselves about the real cost of these things, and I think it's necessity that they do that, because if they knew the real cost, they would never do it. They'd never start. Equally, most people get away with it, but some people you meet just get in the most awful situation where they're just stuck. And a half-finished house is next to worthless. I mean, it's a disaster. So you really don't want to fall into that. So the planning in terms of cost plan, really important. Get your schedule really organised, and start tendering things way down the line, or start those conversations around plumbing, plasterboard, And I think go to specialists. They might be more expensive, but it's so much less hassle. Like, if you're going to get a suspended roof system in, go to a suspended roof company, get a quote from them. Even if they're quite big, you'll be amazed that they're really cost effective. And it might be that, but Bob or Sue or whatever is working at 160 quid a day, surely it looks cheaper to begin with. I bet you it won't be by the end. You know, the guys who do, or the people that do one thing day in, day out are often very quick and really good value when you look into it in hindsight. So don't be afraid of using specialists.
Well, Charlie, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
No worries. No, it's very enjoyable having a chat.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/251. You can review the main information that we've been talking about. We always provide a summary. We got photos of Charlie's new house, well, some of the old house as well, the thatched cottage too. We've got a couple of videos that we've embedded from Home Building and Renovating's YouTube channel, and we'll link you across to the other ones that you can find there because they made quite a few. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, well, you can deal with it in two ways. One is to head down to the bottom of the show notes and there's a place to leave your messages there, or catch up with us on social media. We'll link you to Charlie on Twitter and also to his main website, Charlie Luxton Design, houseplanninghelp.com/251. Now, finishing up today, just a favour if you've enjoyed the podcast, this one, if you've listened to others, if you found them useful, please write us an iTunes review. What this does is it just makes others aware of what the podcast's all about to begin with, and hopefully will bump us up the rankings as well. So that'll mean even more people can find us. The other way is simply if you meet someone who's on a self-build journey looking to make it as ecological as possible, well, you could just tell them. Find them at houseplanninghelp.com. That's what you could say. But yeah, iTunes, if you're on there, it's still the main directory. There are loads of others. So wherever you're listening, a short review, I'm sure, will help in a big way. Thanks. That's your lot for today. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.